The inability of women or the discrimination against women is sort of the backdrop of my whole career. But I also had the opportunity over and over again to ride the crest of the women's movement, how much women had opened doors for me, how much the Kerner Commission and various studies about broadcasting said we need women, we need minorities in the public square. Those things also opened doors for me. So I feel my experience has been more opportunity. I went to a college, all women's college. There was no journalism degree. I went to the library every day and read the New York Times. They knew I was nuts. Started a newspaper in grammar school. I mean, there was nothing I ever wanted to do but be a journalist. When I got out of college, I had all the ambition and went immediately to graduate school and was told at the University of Wisconsin in my class, you'll be lucky if you get to the traffic department. There's no opportunities for women. I didn't stay. I went with my little resume and got a job at NBC in New York and began my career there. And like so many women, I didn't start at the lowest levels getting coffee and doing the scripts and the AP wire, because only guys did that. They said to me, how fast do you type? And I typed real fast. So I really began as a secretary. So that was my start. Ambition, drive, and the ability to type. When I worked for Cronkite, I was called a correspondent. So people thought that I was doing more than I was. I was really answering all his mail. And to make an impact upon CBS, I mean, I was in the office right off the studio where the news was done every day. So I saw the integrity and the power and the importance of network news at the highest level then. And it was a wonderful opportunity. But it was all girls in my office and all guys in the studio and really producing the news. So there was no way I was a working journalist at that time. Everyone had said to me, you got to leave New York. And so I went with great enthusiasm. I had done a lot of work around Attica with the Buffalo news director at CBS in Buffalo. So I interviewed with him. He didn't hire me. There were no women journalists at that time on the street. And so I went to the university and I worked in their news information department. And this was my route. I came up with story ideas all the time. And the TV stations would call or the reporters would come up and say, what do you got for me today? I got to produce a story. And I always had a story. And one day, a cameraman, Terry Johnson, and a reporter, Stu Dan, came by to do a story and said, you want to be a journalist, I think I remember. You want to be on the air. We're looking for a woman. Well, I had that credential. And that was my opportunity. And I started WGR in Buffalo. And I was the first woman on television in Buffalo. And so I had tremendous opportunity.
Channel 2 has learned that Mr. Gorski will make a decision shortly to either resign or remain in office. Our sources tell us he will probably resign. Susan King, Channel 2 News.
We were hot. At least we felt we were hot. We felt like we were making the town look at an aggressive news organization.
Buffalo put its arms around me. And even though I had the drive and the desire to be a journalist, I also had in that city the opportunity to be more than an ambitious young woman. I was able to have meaning in that job because I represented all the aspirations and the hopes of moms and young women to really, in the 70s, want to be more than we had been told we could be.
She moved to Washington, D.C. in 1975, where she became a weekend anchor at WTOP TV. Susan found her niche in reporting on political, community, and social issues. It wasn't long until Susan moved to ABC News in 1979, where she served as a correspondent in the Washington Bureau.
We have Susan King standing by at George Bush headquarters,
Absolutely.
and we'd like to hear what she has to tell us.
Well, Ted, George Bush and his wife Barbara Bush just met with reporters in a very crowded lobby on the floor where he is staying.
From 1983 to 1987, Susan anchored the 6 and 11 p.m. newscasts at WRC-TV in Washington. In 1987, Susan moved to WJLA-TV, still in Washington, and anchored the 5, 6, and 11 o'clock newscasts regularly. She was recruited to the station to bring her award-winning cover story feature with her. January 2012, Susan King joined the University of North Carolina School of Journalism and Mass Communication as its dean and distinguished professor.
One of the other ambitious reporters in the Buffalo newsroom, a guy, said to me, "Believe me, I'm going to be out the door and covering the big story before you." I said, "Just watch." And whatever the big story was, I don't know if it was an explosion at Bethlehem Steel or a fire in in one of our inner city neighborhoods or what, I was out the door in the car and I was on that story. I mean, I was tough. I was also confident, and I also knew where there were boundaries, and I wasn't letting any men invade my boundaries. So I do not feel strongly that harassment was part of my experience. Definitely people talk you down, but there was some inner drive I had that would just not listen to that. I was in Beirut. I always remember the story. I was in Beirut. I was down at the bar, at the Commodore. I'd worked all day, and there was this whole culture that made me realize I was never going to be a war correspondent. But I'm chatting with two guys, network newsmen who I'd seen on the air. I go up to my room and the phone rings, and I pick it up, and one of the two had called and said, "Can I come up?" And I said, "What for?" I'm a complete advocate for women's voice in newsrooms and in corporations everywhere. I started an organization with Judy Woodruff in 1990 called the International Women's Media Foundation, which is doing better than we ever imagined now. And our whole argument was that women's voices needed to be more powerful within the news business. In other words, women's news needed to be front page news. Now we don't even question that. Look at the campaign of 2024 and the impact of preschool education on kids and family and medical leave and all these issues that, were not kind of like hard news back in the day. I believe that women's perspective and understanding 50% of the reality of American life is really important to have in a newsroom. And I would find in those earliest days in Buffalo that when we'd sit around and say, what should we do as a news story, especially on a Monday morning, the guys would have the perspective from the golf course or a football game or whatever they were involved with. And women's ideas were different and added real depth, I think, to news coverage and ideas of what makes news. News is what's news to you. And so you need to have women in the newsroom. You need to have all diversity. I am very, very committed to the idea of diverse leadership because I think perspective and point of view just enhances the information stream immensely. It's not what I would call discrimination. It's the one woman syndrome. When I was in Washington, I think I was there a year, maybe two, and I took vacation. And while I was gone, they hired a new woman. And people called on the air and said, "What happened to Susan King?" Of course, they didn't think there'd be another woman reporter, out doing. So when I came back, I could hear the cameraman sort of saying, "Oh boy, two women here, two tough women, two driven women. This will be a cat fight." So I pulled her back. And to tell you when the time was, I pulled her back into the film room, where you put the film and it had to go through the soup to be developed. And I said, "Look, I hear these guys. I've heard nothing but great things about you. If there is another great woman in this newsroom, it's just going to make me look better. We need more women. I am going to be your best friend." That woman is Andrea Mitchell. And we became great friends. She left when the Washington Post swapped the station and went to NBC, and she's been there ever since. Were there other women reporting? No. There was Andrea and me for most of that time. And when we left, new people came in, but it was no longer owned by the Washington Post. Were there women producers? Not really. Were there a woman writer here or there? Yes. Were there women editors? No. Were there women cameramen? No. Did it happen later in the 70s and into the 80s? Yes. But when I came to Washington, it was still a man's world. I started a women's group when I went to ABC News, and that was in '79.
The underrepresentation of women in the news persists, and there's been no improvement in the 21st century. A single woman's voice today is countered by at least 3 men, which is why we're supporting women journalists with more opportunities to tell all of our stories.
And so I started it in my dining room in Washington. Carol Simpson was there. She took it to much higher levels than I ever did during her years at ABC News. And we sat down to try to make sure that we saw each other as colleagues and that we could share problems. And at one of those dinners, it did come up that there was, some, harassment and fear among some of the women that if they didn't play correctly, they weren't going to move ahead. So we tried to bring that out. And Carol was very forceful as the voice of women at ABC News, I think, for many years. I'm willing to stand up, but I also want to make sure that we don't just whine. So that's been my strategy, always about pushing forward. When I started the International Women's Media Foundation with the group of fabulous women in Washington, we put on a big event, had women from all over the world, raised money for it, and had an event at the Women's Museum. And as we were planning what we would do, I thought, we cannot be seen as women who are whining. That was kind of a theme that was out there. So I came up with the idea, we were going to give awards at this gala. And I named them Courage in Journalism Awards. Women who are on the front lines using their courage to continue a brand of journalism that mattered. And those awards are still happening every year. And they were dynamic, showed women in Colombia and Haiti that first year. Katharine Graham spoke. We showed women's power collectively and moved the agenda forward. And no one could say we were whining, but we were making a point, and we were making a point that women deserved certain equality on the courage front, on the reporting front, and on every other front. I think that having now taught millennials and Gen Zs that the women professionals do not realize how much internal fight you need to be able to make it for the long haul. I'm not sure every generation has to fight, but depends what you want. And our generation had to fight. The civil rights movement was the shaping experience of my teenagehood and my adulthood. And I wanted to watch our country change. So I wanted to cover politics. It was a boring day. It was some holiday, maybe Labor Day. And I'd heard word that the Democratic power broker, who was really New York State Democratic chair and the real political boss in New York, was meeting with some people on this holiday. I said, there's nothing going on. Give me a crew. And we went over to the office. And as I walked into the lobby, out coming was the head of the fire department, an African-American, one of the few African-Americans in leadership in Buffalo. I said, hey, how are you? What's going on? And he looks at me and says, I was just fired. And I knew he was coming out of Krangle's office. I said to my cameraman, get that camera rolling, and we interviewed. And then I went up to the boss's office, Joe Krangle, put the camera rolling. He said, what you doing here? I said, well, you just fired the fire chief. What made you do that? I mean, he didn't work for the political boss. And that led the newscast that night. And I beat the newspapers. And that made me really proud and put me on the map in the towns, especially their boys club, that I was a reporter who had the stuff. What was the great opportunity of my life in Buffalo was the anchorman news director left, and they were without a anchorman during the summer of '74, which was the summer of Watergate and Nixon's resignation. And so they asked me to anchor. I was the weekend anchor at that point, and I anchored 6 days or 7 days a week, but all through a time when people were really watching the news. And I did okay. I was still, when I look at the pictures, I was pretty young, but I did okay. And all of a sudden, I have this piece that the TV critic wrote about me, and he picked me as the person of the year because I had anchored successfully such an important newscast, and that he had heard from so many viewers and people within Buffalo. And this is what he said. During her short summer as boss anchorman for Channel 2, she became a symbol, a source of pride and satisfaction for women of many different backgrounds and points of view. They got a lot more than the news out of watching her do her job at 4, and they didn't want her to be taken off the air. I would say to our journalist students when I was dean, this is the greatest thing you can do. It's so exciting to be on the front lines of journalism and in the public square, but it may not be a career for life. And that's the way I feel. Journalism is not something you go into and figure, I'm going to do this for the next 50 years. I think you're going to use it for a period of time and then figure out your next step. I really urge young journalists, do it. Do it for a decade. Give it everything you have. Don't be cheap about it. Remember the audience you're serving. Peel back the complicated issues. Learn everything you can. Walk in other people's shoes. Journalism is a great profession. It may not be forever. At every turn in my career, I've taken a stand that has benefited someone, but not always me. And so I just realized that's my makeup. I did that as dean also. There were bringing changes on, and they brought me in and said, we no longer want you as anchor, but we want you to stay. And then proceeded to say a few things that made me think, this is a business decision and they're really minimizing me. And I did a grievance. People, I won that grievance. It took 2 years and protected particularly every male in Washington, D.C., that you would give severance if you were sort of disengaged. But that did not make management people thrilled that I would challenge the leadership like that. But all I was saying is, if you want me to go, pay me my severance and get rid of me. Or, don't, we owe something. And I was a pretty active union member. And did I regret that? No. But I realized that probably shortened my career as a journalist. And after that, I took some time to figure out what to do and made a pivot. And I went into government eventually as a presidential appointee. One has to constantly ask myself, why am I doing what I'm doing? And I have done that at times, and I've had opportunities at times, I've had setbacks. But the pivots that I've taken have enhanced my life. And probably thank you, Buffalo, for giving me that sense of confidence and purpose in my career. I feel like I have no regrets. Fame is hollow. I've had fame at different points in my life. And I find now I have great family ties. My daughter and my granddaughter live with me. I have great friends, and I have had a great career. Buffalo infused me with a satisfaction and a sense of purpose as a journalist, not just sheer desire for fame or rewards or, the other things that go with being a journalist. They gave me a sense of pride and purpose, and that has infused my whole career, from journalism in Buffalo to Washington to network to being a dean. I really have a sense of purpose and a sense of the power of being a journalist and what a great privilege it is to be a journalist.